Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Here we are on our 12th session of the Bezels of Wisdom course. Hope everybody is okay. Everybody has been doing well. This is a very compact chapter, and in its compactness, this chapter of Ismail that we're about to read, and in its compactness, there is quite a bit of things, quite a lot of different issues. Someone was kind enough this week, they told me about it a while ago. They had another edition of the Fusus al-Hikam, and they mailed it to me because they can't read Arabic, but they found it in their library. And this was published in 2005. I didn't know about this edition, but it is a subsequent edition to Abdul A'la Afifi's edition, but preceding the edition of Sayyid Nizam ad-Din Ahmad. It is not a bad edition. He doesn't really change much in the edition of Afifi, just a few very incredibly minor things. But it's a handy little, edition, that I have now. So we have 3 editions of this, and the third one I didn't know about. Okie dokie. Let's get cracking into this chapter of Ismail, or Ishmael in the way it's translated into English. Okie dokie. He says, know that which is termed God is one through the essence and all through the names. Each created being is related to God only as being its particular Lord, since its relationship to God as the all is impossible. As regards to divine unity, there is no place in it for one as being one of many, nor does it admit of any differentiation or distinction. His unity integrates all in potentiality. Blessed is the one with whom the Lord is pleased. Indeed, there is none but is pleasing in the sight of his Lord, since it is by him that the Lord maintains his lordship, so that he is pleasing in the sight of this Lord and is blessed. This whole paragraph is basically a gloss on the 28th or 27th and 28th verses of the Surah Al-Fajr, the 89th Surah of the Quran. In this connection, Sahl ibn Tostari said, in lordship is my mystery, that mystery being you, which means every being, and were it to cease, the lordship would cease. Here he uses the words were to, which imply impossibility, since it will not cease, nor yet the lordship, since the being exists only by its Lord. The being always exists, and the lordship never ceases. One who is pleasing is love, so that all the loved one does is also loved. Indeed, all is pleasing, since the individual being itself does not act, but its Lord in it. Thus, the being is content that an action should be assigned to it and is pleased with that which is manifest in it and from it by its Lord. These actions are pleasing because every doer or maker is pleased with that which he does or makes, and bestows on his action or work all that is necessary, as he bestows on all he has created and then guides, making it clear that it is he who bestowed on all he has created, so that it is neither more nor less than it should be. Ismail was well pleasing to his Lord because he had come to know what we have mentioned, just as every created being is well pleasing. It does not follow, however, that because a created being is well pleasing to his Lord, he is equally so to the Lord of some other servant, since he has his lordship from a source embracing many, not only one. Thus, from the totality of divine aspect, each being is assigned one particularly suited to it to be its Lord. This Lord is assigned from God in his names, not from God in his unity. This is such an important point that I cannot overemphasize this matter enough, because this here nuances what wahdat al-wujud actually even means. And later on, then how Mullah Sadra breaks it down in his own philosophy as tashkik fil wujud, the gradations within existence. This paragraph is key to it. And in the Asfar al-Arba, the four intellectual journeys of the soul, this is one of the paragraphs that Mullah Sadra unpacks very, very surgically, to explain and delineate his concept of tashkik, of gradation. For this reason, the folk are barred from a divine self-revelation of his unity. Hence, what the bayan means by the adjective al-amna, when it says Bismillah al-amna il-aqdas, impregnability. So this element of the ahadiyya, the exclusive oneness, is completely impenetrable. It is impregnable. No one has any knowledge of it, including the highest of the Gnostics or the prophets and messengers. Were you to look on him through him, you should know that. He is always looking on himself by himself. Were you to look on him through you, his unity would vanish in your being you. The same would be the case if you looked on him and through you. This is because by positing yourself in the pronoun you look, you're positing something other than that what is looked on, thus establishing a relation between two things, the observer and the thing observed, therefore thereby nullifying the unity, the ahadiyya, which admits of no other. Although in reality only it sees itself alone through itself. Here also there would appear to be observer and observed. Both are it. And now recall, back in the chapter of Seth, when we had that poem, where he says that he knows and he doesn't know, when you had all those various paradoxes that Ibn Arabi cited in that poem in the latter part of the chapter of Seth, here this becomes a gloss on what that even means in relation to the Gnostic. It is not unusual for one who is pleasing to be absolutely so, unless all he manifests is from the action of the one pleased within him. Ismail was more so than other beings in that the reality describes him as being pleasing to his Lord. It is said, to every tranquil soul, nafs al-mutma'ina, return to your Lord, irja ila rabbika, so that it is to its own Lord, the one who summoned it, which it knows apart from all the others, pleasing and well-pleasing. Radiyatan mardiya. Enter among my servant, ittaqi fi jannati, insofar as they have the same station. The servants mentioned here are those who know their Lord, Most High, reserving themselves to it and not to any other, despite the essential unity of all being. And enter into my paradise, ittaqi fi jannati, which is my covering. My paradise is none other than you, for it is you who hide me with your individual self. Nor am I known except by you, as you have been only through me. Who knows you knows me, nor am I known by another, as you also are not known. When you enter into its paradise, you enter into yourself. This is so key to understanding then the Bayan's idea of what Jannah means. Then you will know yourself with a gnosis other than that by which you knew your Lord by knowing yourself. Right? So this is such a key thing. So self-knowledge, right, is paradise. It is the Jannah. It is the Jannah of the Gnostic. And it is an immediate one. It is not something that the whole notion of the akhirah then now starts to become extremely relative. We're not necessarily even talking about a post-mortem state. We could talk about a post-mortem state in relation to a nafs al-amara, a soul, an ego that has been subdued, right? So then death and life become a relative thing within life itself. Hence the meaning of the prophetic saying, die before you die. Thus, You will be possessed of two kinds of gnosis. First, knowing it as knowing yourself. Second, knowing it through you as it, not as you. So here we have Ibn Arabi glossing in as clear way as is possible to do that, what the meaning of fana and baqa actually mean. Those two last sentences basically underscore what the actual meaning of fana and baqa are. You are servant and you are Lord, for one for whom and in whom you are servant. You are Lord and you are servant, for one who reminds of the covenant in his address. Every particular servant-Lord relationship is dissolved by every other relationship. God is pleased with his servants, and they are well-pleasing, and they are pleased with him, and he is pleasing. Thus, the two planes, servants and lords, are contrasted like similars that are, in a sense, opposed, since no two similar things can unite. Otherwise, there would be no distinction. There is, in fact, only he who is distinct, nor is there any similarity within. In existence, there is no similarity or dissimilarity, for there is but one reality, and a thing is not opposite to itself. Now, before I read that poem that comes after it, Maulana Rumi has a very, very beautiful way of putting this, what Ibn Arabi just put his finger on in one of his poems, where he says, Chon bi rangi asir rang shud, Musa ba Isa andar jang shud. When colorlessness became the captive of color, and Moses went to war with Jesus. Now, Ibn Arabi's poem. Not save the reality remains, no being. There is no arriving and no being afar. Spiritual visions confirm this, for I have not seen aught but him when I looked. That is for one who fears is loathed, meaning who fears that he be him, since he knows the distinction between servant and Lord. This is further demonstrated to us by the fact that some beings are ignorant of what I, for example, know, for there are surely distinctions between servants as also between lords. Were it not for this distinction, one divine name would be interpreted in every way as another. The name the strengthener is not understood in the same way as the name the abaser, and so on. However, from the standpoint of the unity, standpoint of the Tawheed, every name evinces both the essence and its own reality, for the one named is one. Thus, the strengthener is the abaser in respect of the one named one, whereas the strengthener is not the abaser in respect of its own relative reality. The signification being different in both of them because they're relative. These are all relations, right? Then the poem. Do not look upon the reality lest you abstract it from creation. Do not look upon creation lest you invest it with what is not the real, al-Haq. Know it as both comparable and incomparable, and so sit in the abode of truth. Be in a state, if integration, if you will, or be in a state of discrimination, if you will. Then you will, through the all, achieve the victor's crown, if indeed a totality reveals itself to you as combining both states. Do not pass away and do not subsist, nor yet annihilate or sustain. Thus, revelation will not be granted you in respect of another, nor will you as Lord grant it in respect of another. Praise is not occasioned by his being true to his threat, but by his being true to his promise of paradise. Indeed, the plane of divinity demands praise, praised by itself, the essence. Thus, it is praised through faithfulness to the promise of paradise and not to the threat of hell. Indeed, through its refraining from its threat. Do not think that God will fail in his promise to his apostles. He does not stay his threat, but further elsewhere, we overlook their wrongdoings, despite his threat in that regard. He praises Ismail for being true to his promise. Thus, possibility or contingency ceases in respect of the real because of its inherent tendency to probability. Only he who is true to his promise subsists, nor does his threat have any true being, even though they enter the abode of distress. They have their pleasure in a delight other than heaven's delight, but they are one in him. The difference between the two being in his self-manifestation. It is called adab because of its sweet taste, like a skin that preserves what is inside. I mean, Ibn Arabi uses the root of adaba with its two senses here, because that root simultaneously can mean both torment and delight. So Ibn Arabi has just played on an extremely subtle element of the Arabic. Were damned, but in another sense, it also denotes sweetness. So this is a very profound gloss on wahdat al-wujud, but also simultaneously what Ibn Arabi has done is put a few distinctions and caveats in place, lest people misunderstand what wahdat al-wujud is. Now, what has always struck me about this particular chapter is that what Ibn Arabi does is essentially answer and kind of delineate an element of Hermetic philosophy that we find especially in Sohrawardi, but even earlier in, for example, some of the Hermetic texts like the Poimandres, and the whole concept that then enters into the Western ceremonial magic tradition known as the Holy Guardian Angel. And this is the concept that Ibn Arabi glosses in his own way as being the fact that everything in existence and individuals in particular are the manifestation of a particular name and attribute of God, which is what the meaning of Lord here is all about. So a Lord is just another way of saying name or attribute. Thus, the Lord that you are, or your Lord, is the name and attribute that governs you, as it were. Your fitra, in other words. That fitri state that you are is the name and attribute that you are, and that is your Lord. And so then this gives us some extremely profound information about what all of this means, how we can actually even know our Lord as opposed to the Lord of another. And then also simultaneously, it is explaining to us then that if this is the case, that this is who we are, then why is there conflict and opposition in the world? And this is answered very beautifully that because of the nature of multiplicity, every individuated thing out there possesses its own Lord, because every individuated thing out there is a manifestation of one of the infinite names and attributes of God. So then this establishes a universal divine presence, such that even in conflict, which has a necessity and a place of its own, God is still present. And so looked at from this perspective, this is what I like. I mean, for issues of, as a therapist or as a counselor, one of the things that has always really helped me with Ibn Arabi is that whereas contemporary counseling, maybe not contemporary, but conventional counseling tends to look at healing methods from the point of view of, for example, you diagnose someone with a borderline paranoia complex, right? What the kind of metaphysics of Ibn Arabi is doing is not necessarily dismissing the reality of that borderline or the paranoia that may exist in someone. What it is doing, it is basically contextualizing what that paranoia may be. So then, rather than to completely, invalidate a condition of a patient, you validate the condition of that patient, and by the validation of their condition, you heal them. You understand? So, by understanding that the oppositions that exist, that the conflicts that may exist, have a sort of ontological necessity because of the nature of the one itself, rather than disempowering an individual and trying to say that they're wrong and there's something wrong with them, and that they need to, completely fix themselves in the sense, you both affirm and deny the veil that they're on, that they're in. On the one hand, you deny the veil as a veil, but you affirm the veil as a screen to the perception of their Lord, as it were. Okay? So this is something I have been using. I've been actually using this particular chapter, formulating a method to try to get into people's heads over certain things that plague them in their lives, especially if they have a tendency to externalize certain phenomena and issues in their life. What I have done is to try to teach them that rather than to externalize the issue, if they internalize the issue, they begin to understand the nature of their own Lord, which is their name. Once, and that means that they need to get authentic with themselves, right? Stop projecting a sort of borderline inauthenticity on their part as being a phenomena that is occurring outside of themselves exclusively. That phenomena is occurring outside of themselves, but by the same token, it is their perception of that phenomena that is coloring how they interpret that phenomena. So once they then loop back into themselves, or you guide them to loop back to themselves and look at the whole full spectrum of the dynamic from their own point of view, that helps them to understand their Lord, the uniqueness, their own way of looking at the world, and you validate that with patience, because that is their way of seeing. If there are gaps or there's still problems, you gently guide them to kind of see how they can tweak their own perception of things. Once they have tweaked the perception of things for themselves, then it is just a matter of time that certain things begin to click with them, where they begin to see that, okay, because I have a unique perspective on a certain situation, and because this unique perspective is something that is metaphysical ultimately, right? Then I need to understand that the same situation is going on externally on the opposite end, right? So this doesn't necessarily invalidate the conflict, but it just basically sheds a different light on its nature. And so then by doing that, then in the long term, you have a very powerful context to help people resolve their own conflicts in the world out there from this kind of perspective. And I've used this specific chapter on many different occasions, just, in the way I framed it with various clients to try to see their problems, to resolve it themselves, rather than them having to, get dependent on me and come to session after session after session. Let them resolve their own problems from this very kind of context. And you could rephrase this however you want, but also understand that you can also apply this in the magical context of things to your own situation, right? Especially as in the esoteric and occult tradition, it is your holy guardian angel, your Lord, who is the responsible agent of bringing forth the productions of your magical operations, right? And once you understand that, then you understand why certain operations may work and why certain operations may not work, right? The ones that work are aligned with the nature of your Lord. The ones that don't are not aligned with the nature of your Lord. Or that alignment is not even occurring within a specific spatio-temporal time frame. It may be occurring atemporally. So that maybe if you want something at one point of time, and it doesn't show up at that point of time, but sometime down the line, very distant, or maybe not so distant, something that you had invoked that you'd completely forgotten about and even given up on manifesting, like that comes into your life. This has happened to me on so many different occasions, I don't even know where to begin. But that is because what is guiding this process is your Lord, the name or attribute, divine attribute that governs your life. Holy guardian angel, or as Suhrawardi puts it, the perfect nature, the Tiba'atam. Hand the floor to you guys.
I think I guess I'll take the floor for the first time. So There's sort of this idea in Jungian psychology of the collective unconscious, which is some sort of transcendental set of ideas, for lack of a better word, that sort of governs an individual's life, right? So what's the distinction here with this concept of almost like a personal divine that Ibn
Lot.
Arabi is
A
pointing
lot.
to?
There's both a lot of differences, but there's also similarities. The differences are as follows. Jung, for all of his brilliance and all the great metaphysical arsenal, esoteric and occult arsenal that he brought into his depth psychology, was fundamentally not a believer in metaphysics. And this has been criticized of Jung. So he has a tendency of psychologizing in a very negative way the kind of esoteric metaphysics that he's playing with, right? So the collective unconscious with Carl Jung is more of this kind of a nebulous reality that occurs on the level of a consensus within spatiotemporality. Whereas if Ibn Arabi looked at the issue of a collective unconscious, he wouldn't talk about collective unconscious. He would talk about the universal nature, the tabi'a kulliyah, which possesses which is an ontological hypostasis in its own right, separate from its instantiations, which are the material forms, right? Jung doesn't look at things that way. Jung, he understood the metaphysics. Nobody has ever accused Carl Jung of misunderstanding the metaphysics. But Jung, because he is a product of a modern psychological model, has this tendency of putting carts before horses, such that the collective unconscious then becomes a sort of a sui generis dynamic that occurs from the bottom up rather than from top down. So he's not looking at a kind of a Neoplatonic framework where things emanate, and produce their own levels and barriers and etc. all the way down to the material world. He is looking at the collective unconscious as something that is being generated from kind of a soup of a collective human experience. And this, in a sense, kind of begs the question: is that, well, if that is the case, where does the chicken and the egg begin? And Jung doesn't want to enter into that kind of a discussion, because then that enters into a discussion of metaphysics proper. So that's the difference. The similarity is that the collective unconscious, by nature of its behavior, right, and that because it is a sort of a substrate, does tend to influence every given entity and individual in a particular way. Usually in the sense that they're not aware of what is going on. But what is suggested implicitly in texts such as this is that when a Gnostic or a person or a subject becomes awakened to some degree and realizes this, then they are at an advantageous position where they can change at least their own perception of what this dynamic is in order to be able to more effectively act within it consciously within the greater stream of things. That would be probably a similarity with another difference to that similarity.
Okay, great. Thank you so much.
Sure. Anybody else?
I have a question, could you, if you're comfortable with it, of course, and it doesn't involve sharing anything personal, like give an example from your own experience as a counselor of someone finding their Lord and how that came about?
Sure. Salman and I did a podcast on this particular one. I had a gentleman here from a Middle Eastern background. He was in his mid-20s. He had been seeing me for a couple of weeks beforehand. He was dating a local woman at the time. And one day he came to me. He was absolutely distraught and near suicidal. He had found out that this woman was two-timing him. And this had triggered every single one of his, narratives, because he had fallen in love with this woman and was talking about marrying her. And I was encouraging him that it was a great thing. And then he found out that he was being two-timed by her, and that his entire world just came crash tumbling down. what I guided him to, this took a while, it took over a year actually to get him to a state of equilibrium, because he was near suicidal after that experience. What I got him to understand is that his totalizing kind of approach to the question, to his own predicament, was the cause of his attraction of this woman to his life to begin with, rather than him being a little bit more discriminating as to who he was going to let into his personal life, that then he would give his heart away to. He was being extremely totalizing in that. And so during the course of the subsequent sessions, we kind of figured out that the narrative that was, in the background of his mind, that had been guiding him and even tormenting him to some degree, was this kind of very, how should I say it? This extremely kahari, this kind of, Gahar both means victorious and vengeful at the same time. But this name, Gahar, was very much in the background of almost everything he did, whether it was in the workplace, whether it was in the way that he was approaching relationships. So he had a sense of, almost in a sense of entitlement, that if a woman had come into his life, he had conquered her. And now this is interesting, because he's not the only person who thinks in these terms. There's a lot of guys out there that are, many men out there who are still thinking in these sorts of terms. And so what they do is that they become overbearing in every conceivable way towards both themselves and their partner. And a lot of that may come from, parental upbringing and all the kinds of things that happens in people's personal lives. But nevertheless, in a sense, that is their lord. The name Gahar is dominating their life. So, I'm not going to deny this guy to say that al-Qahar is not your Lord, it's not your name. But what he needed to understand is that this intensity in the way that he is approaching all of these various personal questions in his life is the instrumental cause that is sabotaging his life. And is also simultaneously both attracting to him the wrong people. And then once it is creating all this, emotional drama, etc. when he's disappointed, when, the woman that he thought he was going to marry turned out to be a two-timer. So it took a while, and it took, quite a few times, late night conversations, which I didn't even charge him for or anything like that, where he would call me at 2 o'clock in the morning, and I would basically talk him out of not slashing his wrists. So this is the sort of personal experience of these sorts of situations that I found. But he's subsequently gotten over it. Time, obviously, is one of the greatest healers. And my conversations with him and kind of trying to drip feed him very slowly these sorts of ideas in this chapter of the Fusus, kind of very slowly but surely got him to get over it. I've heard that he's subsequently found himself a new partner, and they're very happily living together at the moment. Alhamdulillah Rabbil Alameen.
Thank you so much. It's very
Sure.
helpful to get these kind of concrete examples. And I guess as a final comment, those kind of situations, I guess they're also what kind of name you're the manifestation of can bring positives and negatives to your life, depending on your culture or whatever time you live in. And I guess, if you have that kind of name, it would have been he would have had a much more beneficial or a sort of easier experience maybe living in the past than he would in the modern age. And that's the kind of interesting dynamic that I guess brings a lot of depth to this, because it's not just the name, it's also just how it interacts with the world itself. So it's don't forsake the creation, as you said. It's that kind of interaction between the two.
This is why, like I've been kind of saying as a refrain throughout this course, these ideas need to have a practical application. It's great that ivory tower and scholars and mystics and philosophers are contemplating these ideas endlessly, but even Arabic has a very practical application in the real world. And I have kind of slowly kind of put this into practice with clients I've had. And I see very positive results, that when you take this kind of metaphysics, this kind of wahdat al-wujudi metaphysics, and apply it in a counseling context, you get results. I mean, there's hard work involved, obviously, but these still get results. Yeah,
Thank you so much.
sure. Anybody else?
Can I ask another question?
Sure, absolutely.
So, existentially, a person will experience various conflicts in their life. What do you do when two names sort of conflict with each other?
Ooh.
So, for instance, sometimes you might not feel like you might feel this tendency towards justice, but then you also feel the tendency towards mercy. How do you settle that tug of war?
Oh, Lordy. Do you have all week? I mean, I have my own personal experience. My father and I were like that. My late father and I worked together in the last decade of his life. And both of us are governed by very Jalali names. I mean, we loved each other. He was my dad, I was his son. But and I don't say it was a mistake that we worked together, but we were clashing all the time. He had his own ideas about how to run the business. I had my ideas about how to run the business. And both of us were coming from, sometimes opposite perspectives. And both of us had extremely Jalali names governing us. And it was tough as nails during that decade that we worked together. But I tried extremely hard not to allow the relationship to completely flounder based on our ideas about how to run a business. And oftentimes he was wrong, and it was and time kind of proved that the decision making about how to run the business, that maybe if we had taken a different course and done things in a different way, that we wouldn't have ended up, at a certain place when the global financial crisis hit back in 2008. But that is the way it is. And in relationships with whether family or couples or friends or whatever, it is very important for, I think, people, especially if they are sensitive to this kind of universe that Ibn Arabi is talking about, to kind of taste and glean each other's lords, that's his word, before getting, more and closer or intimate with somebody, and especially in a marriage situation. This is more than just about astrology and, what signs govern you. Because even within that infinite hue of types, under astrological signs, there is still the particular lord of each individual that is governing them. And sometimes that takes a lifetime, to figure out. But other times it may take even, less time to figure out, But one thing I have found is that two people, one who is coming from a Jalali kind of lord, and another one who's coming from a Jamali kind of lord, tend to mesh with each other much better. They become like oil and water. Whereas the other one, if you have two Jalalis or two Jamalis, maybe they will, maybe they won't. Usually the two Jalalis usually end up fighting each other and getting through big squabbles. But each situation is obviously unique, and it kind of takes a discernment between the two individuals, or at least one of them anyway. Yeah.
Okay, cool. Thank you.
Sure.
I think he was asking about conflicting names within one individual.
That happens. Well, let's put it this way.
That's a hard question.
It's not even a matter of conflicting names within an individual, because each name, as we've been learning, each name contains all the names, right? So your Lord is your Lord, but this Lord may at any time, or that particular name may at any time reflect the nuances of an infinite array of other names. Okay, at any given time. And that's also because of the nature of these incessant theophanies and incessant creations and recreations that is going on ontologically. So yeah, that happens, of course.
Yeah, sorry to I guess ask another question in that vein. When that does happen, is there a tendency where one name has to supersede the other? So for instance, does the merciful have to reflect the just, or does the just reflect the merciful? And I feel like
Good,
sometimes it
great
might be
question.
difficult for a person to choose. I mean, obviously, eventually, they're both true in a sense, but our perception is so, I guess, unsubtle. And so, like, what's it like?
It depends on the situation, I mean, I've thought about this question that you just posed, and given a variety of historical settings. Like, one of the questions I have about early Islam is that why didn't the Prophet, when he had the chance after he conquered Mecca, put the Bani Umayyah all to the sword? They had persecuted him, and then after he passed away, they persecuted his children, and were responsible ultimately for what happened to Fatima when they tried to break the door of their house down, and the door fell on her and she miscarried baby Muhsin. And then later, they were responsible for the murder of Hussein, etc. I've asked this question. So at the time when the Prophet, peace be upon him, conquered Mecca, the name Al-Rahman was the overriding name, the all-comprehensive name. So he just gave these people a total amnesty. Whereas maybe at a different time, maybe the name Al-Rahman would have been also simultaneously tempered with Al-Adil, the just, or Adl. And maybe if he didn't put them all to the sword, he would have at least disenfranchised them, not recognized their shahada, not recognized, warned people to keep these people at arm's length. They could potentially create problems for the ummah at a later time after I'm gone, etc., etc. I've asked for years. I have asked this question. Ya Allah. I mean, if the mercy and the wrath can occur in the here and now at this very moment, doesn't need to be postponed, wouldn't it have made more sense that once the Muslims conquered Mecca, that they would have done something to Abu Sufyan and his children, rather than to then embrace them and allow them to come into the ummah, which they then created these unbelievable problems, for the ummah. Number one, by breaking the mithaq, the covenant of the Prophet Muhammad, in who he had designated as his wali, which is, in my opinion, has been the fundamental problem that has plagued the ummah since that very moment that Muhammad closed his eyes to the world. He says, "Man kuntu mawlahu fa'ada aliyat mawla." Whosoever takes me as master, Ali is his master. This is not just recorded in the Shia sources. You can go look at the Sahih al-Bukhari. This very hadith, in slightly different wording in several different versions, is already in the Sahih Bukhari itself. So it's not like we're making it up. But this happened, and what had happened, it in my opinion, it unleashed this train of events that brought, that created all this division, all this animosity, all this unnecessary death, all these unnecessary things that have been happening for the last almost 1,500 years. Whereas if at the beginning, they had nipped the problem in the bud at the very moment that they had walked, into Mecca, nipped the problem in the bud, this would have never happened. None of this. There would have never been a Sarifa problem. There would have never been a Karbala. There would never have been the poisoning of Hassan. There would have never been the unbelievable suffering that the Ayyimah went through, at the hands of other Muslims. These children of Muhammad, and had the Ummah listened to the wisdom. It's not just about them. It's about the wisdom that these Imams embodied. Had the Ummah listened to the wisdom of the Imams, then we as an Ummah would have been living in a lot more peaceful, lot more, lot deeper, a lot better, a lot more balanced, Ummah than the one that we have been living in the last 1,400, 1,500 years. And same goes for other religions as well. I mean, Christianity, similar thing. One can say the same about Judaism, most of these religions. When they reject their Awsiya and Awliya, there seems to be at that very moment when they make this wrong turn, everything goes pear-shaped from that moment. And it's also like the human being that, you know, when they occur within a cross in the road and two choices are put before them without any foreknowledge of, you know, or maybe some foreknowledge about which way each road will go, and they pick the wrong one, then all of the various causalities that is associated with the wrong turn taken just proceed snowballing until, you know, they realize they took the wrong turn at Albuquerque and either retrace their steps or do something differently.
Cool, thank you.
Saidi, continuing from what you are saying, that when making the wrong choice, the snowball of causality starts to fall down. Can we connect it with the ayah, which are saying, for example, that the punishment of some types of people usually translated that it is eternal, but for example, خالدين فيها, that it would mean when you make this wrong choice, that the punishment خالدين فيها, it will not end until the whole cycle of causality turns, and only then you will have the possibility to go out for the vicious circle.
Yes. Boom. Yes. That's exactly it. You put your finger on it. Yeah. That's exactly what happens. Because of the fact that all possibilities must exhaust themselves, this is the element here that is extreme. I've spent many sleepless nights thinking about, because of that, once a causality is initiated, it must completely expend itself, right? This is also the reason why certain people, even when they realize a problem in a given causality, cannot stop the causality. And Indian metaphysics has a very interesting way of describing that, so I've had to go to their text to understand this. And that is, when certain texts of Indian philosophy talk about karma, they say that karma cannot be stopped. It must be burnt. Right? So you can only burn karma out. You cannot stop its trajectory. Okay? So yes, you put your finger on the nerve of a very important issue. And this is another reason why when somebody makes a particular choice in life, or a group of or a collective make a choice, they need to be a lot more deliberate and think a lot more carefully about that choice and decision they're making before they make it. Because once you make that decision, then a whole train of causality is associated with that decision until that causality burns itself, or the karma burns itself out, or the causality concludes. Yes, you put your wonderful, wonderful example. Yes, very important.
And here the other thing, when you talked about the prophets and the imam and so on, a critic, which at least common understanding amongst the people, that in some sense they were very politically naive people, because they allowed to happen such things as you explained. But the way I see the things, and please correct me if I'm wrong, that they were acting exactly in the same manner in which Allah Ta'ala is acting, because He do not punish us for our future sins unless we do the wrong thing, and only then He takes the action. So the Prophet and the Imams, they very well know what will happen, but they, in some sense, didn't act to the people with their knowledge about the future, but they took only the measure after the evil or the
Yes.
good had happened.
Yeah, perfect. That's a great way of explaining this. I've kind of concluded this same thing myself. The only difference is that the Sufyanis, the Bani Umayyah, were already guilty. They were already criminals. So it wasn't the case that at a certain point when the Muslims finally entered Mecca that these people were innocent. They had been guilty from the very moment that Muhammad said La ilaha illallah, of all litany of crimes. So the question then arises, and it has been the question lingering in my mind, is still unresolved to some degree, is that given what they had done, I mean, I understand it. If these people had been innocent and only in the future they would become criminals, your point perfectly stands, because that is the case. And so you have a given saint or messenger has no choice but to say, Ufita, you're pardoned. But these people were criminals, right? It's as if, for example, I mean, this is an extreme example, but let's say that, Pol Pot was arrested by the International Court, Criminal Court, and rather than try him for the crimes that he committed against the people of Cambodia, the criminal court said, well, you were dumb, you were desperate, go on your merry way. The interests of justice are not served. And in many contexts, justice itself is the mercy. And the non-execution of justice then becomes non-mercy. Do you understand what I'm saying? Mercy is not just this fluffy, soft, I forgive you, bygones become bygones. Mercy also includes within it justice.
Just as said in the ayah, وَلَكُمْ فِي الْقِصَاصِ حَيَاةٌ. In the killing, the guilty one, there is a life for the...
Yeah. If, for example, let's put this to a historical example. Let's say at the end of the Second World War, there had been no Nuremberg trial, there had been no accounting, and the Allies, at least in the Western sector, had decided to let go all of these high-ranking Nazis and send them out into the population. What kind of precedent would that have set for the future? And this is after everything that happened, for example, in the Eastern Front, on the Russian front, etc., the absolute atrocities that the German Wehrmacht, not just the SS and the Einsatzgruppen did to the Jews or the Gypsy, etc., but what they did, what the German military itself committed against the civilian populations in Russia, Ukraine, Romania, Poland, etc. If there had been no accounting of this, if the crimes of these Nazis had not been laid out in this trial, and no international law or precedent had been set in 1945, 1946, where would we be today as a world? I mean, things are already, kind of starting to unravel since that period. But imagine if there had been no Nuremberg, how much worse it would have been. So this was mercy in a sense. What happened? I mean, I'm no fan of the American Allies. I'm no fan of Stalin. I'm no fan, obviously, of Hitler and the Third Reich. But nevertheless, under the circumstances that the world found itself in, the best possible situation unfolded at the end of the Second World War. To have that trial, to try these people, to get testimony, to put evidence in front of a court, to enshrine some form of international criminal court. Even though, unfortunately, in these times, these sorts of things seems to only apply to third world people rather than first world people. But nevertheless, in 1945, 46, 47, they were applied to Germans, the actual first world Europeans.
Yeah, and just to add on to that, I guess, I mean, when these things occur at the time, we don't see that long-term benefit, or, especially since it was around the same time this was happening that nuclear weapons were invented. And obviously now humans have the ability to wipe out all life on Earth. Yeah. So now we're playing a completely different game. And, if you look at the way the world is heading now, already, they're developing tactical nuclear weapons, and, those kind of things are just, and, who knows if they've already been used. Honestly, we don't know. at this point. But yeah, it's that kind of like, only applying justice partially eventually catches up, because
Yes.
it's only a matter of time before this Russia, China, US, something happens, and it's going to be disastrous for all of them.
Or not even that, the Israelis, what they're doing to Gaza at the moment, which has been just I don't know what else that you can call this. Was this full-blown genocide of an innocent civilian population. And there are some people who have accused the Israelis already of having used during this conflict tactical nuclear weapons. Now, the Israelis deny it and dismiss people who say these sorts of things, but the accusation still exists that they have been doing that. Now, besides even tactical nuclear weapons, they're accused of having used phosphorus, which under international law is considered a war crime, because phosphorus agents burn. They explode in the atmosphere and they burn on their way down. And anything that they, any human skin or whatever they get in contact with, they burn all the way through. And they have done that. Not just now, but also in 2014 and subsequently. So yes, this is it. If justice is implemented partially, then at some point in the future it catches up with you, and this time the monster is back wanting revenge. So you have to nip it in the bud. So what happened in Nuremberg for that time was a good thing, but my question is still unresolved, that the Muslims, after what they had experienced from these Qurayshis and the Umayyads particularly, should have, at the very minimum, just basically ostracized these Bani Umayyah from their own ranks and not allow them to infiltrate the Ummah to then create such incredible problems for the Ummah, and especially the family of the Prophet, that they did afterwards.
Yeah, it's unfortunate because the aristocracy of Mecca being kept in place, like there was a sort of like, this is a kind of reoccurring thing in history where you have a revolution, but it's not, it keeps some members of the old guard, and then eventually the revolution subverted. And that's exactly what happened in the Islamic case. And obviously, the Umayyad Caliphate, there were so many rebellions. It was just complete bloodbath. Like even after Yazid, there's like 1 million of them. And then finally the Abbasids come, and then, that's so many bloodbaths there. And then eventually the Abbasid Caliph is just made into a puppet. And it's just kind of like the whole Muslim world just like has never united since that time.
And I trace all of this back to the events of the Saqifa. This, to me, that if we were to look at the cause that was unleashed, that is still kind of burning itself out and still hasn't completely burnt itself out, you trace it all back to the Saqifa. Had there been another outcome to Saqifa and also to another kind of decision when the Muslims marched into Mecca and how they had dealt with the Bani Umayyah, that wouldn't have happened. None of that would have transpired. There would have been obviously other problems and other challenges and other conflicts, but not what we have experienced for the last 14, 1500 years. So what Hassan is saying, and what he put his finger on about a cause once unleashed has to burn itself, had to expend itself, is 100% correct. And Ibn Arabi would be the first to recognize this. And so this is one of the reasons why in a given suluk, a sheikh or a murshid who is responsible will gauge as much of the variables in the life of their given murid to then diagnose the practice correctly, so that there is not an inadvertent unleashing of a monster out of their murid that then creates a problem both for the murid itself and everybody else around them. These things are very real. The consequences of decisions made, in a sense, has a divine reality, because these ayana thabita, right? Once a particular modality of them are unleashed and they become wujud ayniya, then only the All High itself can stop it, and the All High will not stop it, because the All High is out to experience and know itself through every infinite form of manifestation. So this is probably the dark side of all of this, of wahdat al-wujud, for lack of a better way to put it.
So exactly on this dark side, at least in the end of the chapter, the Sheikh sounds to me a little bit Ash'ari, because the Ash'ari, they are the Jabri that all is already predestined and so on. What I mean, in the words that he is saying, everything which happens, it happens with the will or let's say the leave of Allah Ta'ala. And then the logical conclusions is everything which happens, regardless good or evil, in our understanding, good or evil, it is by the permission of God. If it is by the permission of God, then it is He is well pleased with it. And then continuing to the, let's say, the end of all of it, superficially say the end all of it, it can end in the paradise, Jannah, or in the hellfire, Adhab, but because Allah Ta'ala is well pleased with all of them, even the Adhab, which is the punishments, it will be sweet to the ones.
There's a historic, I give you you all know that I don't like the system, the regime in Iran at all, right? Now, the Ayatollah Khomeini was a big fan of Ibn Arabi, big fan. He used to, and there was a point maybe about 20, 30 years before he came to power that he was actually teaching these texts in the Fayziyah in Qom. I don't like Khomeini, but that's neither here nor there. The fact is that what you just said is precisely how the Ayatollah Khomeini saw his own revolution, right? So he had attained his own paradise of coming to power and establishing his vision of the Vilayat al-Faqih, but at the expense of the hell that he created for the Iranian people and his political opposition. So this is where an example of where the lords are colliding in a real life historical situation. So because Khomeini and his immediate followers and his students were in their Jannah, they've taken power, they'd overthrown the Shah, driven out all these modernists and whatnot out of Iran. But for them, that they've driven out, and not even for them, for other people who trusted these people at the beginning of the revolution and were betrayed by Khomeini, this all became a living hell, as it is still today. So yeah. Yep. Another element of the dark side of wahdat al-wujud.
Do you think he ever recognized that sort of irony there? Do you think Khomeini ever recognized the irony behind that? Or
well, some people say he did. Mansour Farhang, who was a very prominent journalist back before the revolution and then after the revolution, and he would go back and forth between Iran and Paris before Khomeini came back. He was there when Khomeini was saying one thing in Paris about the kind of society that would emerge in Iran after the Shah, and then he was obviously there after Khomeini came back and the Islamic Republic was established. And sometime around 1980, 1981, probably 1981, he went to see Khomeini, and he said, Imam, you said that Iran would become free, and that we are not trying to impose another dictatorship or any of the thing, but this is what you said in Paris. And Khomeini's response to him was, Khod kardim, we deceived you. He said this to Mansour Farhang, one of the most prominent journalists of 20th century Iran.
That's certainly not very, I guess, that is definitely the dark side of wahdat al-wujud, I have to say.
Big time. Big time. So this is the thing, that I tell everybody who comes across these kinds of ideas is that, no matter how great and how liberating these kind of ideas are, but at the same time, you need to always be on top of your nafs. You need to always be on top of seeing the bigger picture. You always need to be on top of seeing the consequence of actions and decisions that you make. And in a therapy situation, this is constantly what I'm hammering into these people, you know, because just like Hassan said, once a given cause is unleashed, God help you in trying to put that genie back into the bottle until that genie burns itself out. Jeff, did you want to say anything?
I'm sorry I'm late.
Yeah, it's okay. All good.
That's all I wanted to say.
Okay, it's all good, man. It's all good.
I'm going to listen to the replay. I missed, but I read the chapter, so I think I've got it. But yeah, I'm very sorry I was late. I had technical
No,
problems.
so you don't have to apologize. The way it is.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Thank
It's all
you.
good. Hassan, did you want to say anything?
Just one more questions, because we
Sure.
spoke when let's say the Arbab, we have internal conflict. Now let's put this conflict on a higher scale. In the beginning of the chapter, where it is explained that the Rab, it is the personal manifestation of, let's say, of wujud mutlaq in respect to you. And by necessity, the Rab you have will be different from the Rab the other person have. No, when we put, but that doesn't mean that your Rab is false Rab in comparison to the other person, or equally, the Rab of the other person is false and the your one is true. Now, in the higher scale, on the level of religion, can we say the same thing? All the, let's say, the blaming, the critique between the different religions. Oh, we are Muslims, the God chosen, or for example, the Christians, we are the God chosen, everyone else is wrong. Because this is what Allah Ta'ala, He, let's say, He willed to happen, that there will be different manifestation for different groups of people, and every one of them have equal right to claim his personal truth.
Sure, yeah, that's there. I mean, there's no, from my perspective, or even Amri, there's absolutely no problem at all with that. Once problems arise, at least in the spatio-temporal world, is when one dominant group tries to browbeat and take away the rights of another, right? Which is what we always seem to see, whether in religious conflicts or just general ideological conflict. It doesn't have to even have to have a religious subtext. You see this in, you know, the various conflicts that you have amongst various left-wing or right-wing groups or within each other, all of that kind of stuff. That's when things become problematic. When then they, you know, a dominant group or a dominator group wants to, you know, strip its opponents or its ideological adversaries of their rights. That becomes, then that's something that it is incumbent, not just on any person of conscience, but especially for the true Gnostic to stop, right then and there, to stop it. And in a sense, from one particular angle, you could look at the earliest history of Islam from that particular angle as well, is that at the very beginning of things, even though when Muhammad was saying La ilaha illallah, he was not taking up arms against these idolaters. He was just telling them, change your ways. Your perspectives are all whacked. They initiated the violence. They initiated the boycotting and just a general violent response. And so then that in itself then created that dialectic of opposition between them and the Muslims that then escalated into full warfare for almost 23 years between these two camps until the Muslims won. And this is another question I've asked, is that had these pagan Arabs been a little bit more forthcoming to Muhammad, that okay, la ilaha illallah, okay, that's your perspective, go for it. Let the best man win in the war of ideas. Had they been that way, the history of Islam would have been different, and the history of that region would have been very different. But each side was trying to exclude the other and dominate the other. But the one side that began the conflict, wanted to dominate and shut the other one up, is the one that ended up losing the conflict. And this seems also a very interesting pattern that seems to replicate itself, is that the person who draws the first blood in a given conflict is the one that always ends up, for some reason, at some point in time, losing the conflict altogether. This happened in the case of early history. So I've seen this in numerous cases in counseling various couples. That the one couple who either demeans or invalidates or acts violently for the first time against the other person is the one that ends up losing out in the relationship when the partner walks away from them, or the relationship breaks down, or they divorce or whatever. Usually.
I do have something to say.
Sure.
It's the idea of compromise. I was thinking about an earlier question that was asked about if there is a conflict between two names. I was thinking that the problem usually is that there's a lack of willingness to compromise, whether it's an individual compromising in their own head, their own voices or names, or in a social environment. Yeah, this need to conquer and dominate something so that you can just cut it off and be free of the annoyance of that other thing.
This is
Anyway,
why
that's all I wanted to say is compromise.
you're-
I don't think
you're correct.
we can't compromise.
Well, the issue from the angle that I see it is the following, and that is what the Quran talks about, the nafs al-amara bil-su, the soul commanding to evil. And when you read the various psychological manuals that the Sufis wrote about this whole dynamic of the nafs al-amara, nafs al-lawama, nafs al-raziyah, marziyah, mutmainah, which is very central to this particular chapter. The kind of things that they have observed and written about in these books of theirs about the psychology of the human mind is that the ego wants to grasp things all the time, right? The ego wants to only validate its own delusions. It cannot compromise. And this is why, in a sense, on a collective level, if more and more individuals engaged in some form of saluk, probably, maybe not immediately, but over time, you would minimize the incidence of mental illness occurring in the world. Because from my angle, outside of the greater sociological plane that triggers mental illness on a collective level, but on the individual level, mental illness is usually always triggered by this wanting to grasp, and then having reality respond in a different way to you. And this creating in itself a kind of a dynamic of angst between wanting to dominate and then being thwarted from that domination. You see this in countless situations of couples, where one or both of them are extremely immature in what a relationship means, the whole give and take and compromise and all of that, that love is not just, these pie in the sky kind of feelings, momentary. Love is hard damn work, and you have to be on top of it 24/7. If you slack off, you lose it. It's just that simple. So when people don't understand this and want to dominate and want to grasp and want to, it's mine, like a little child, right? Then this is the sort of thing, these are the sorts of responses that they get. Now, I extend this also into political theory and into historical reality. We talked about Iran. I look at the whole phenomena of theocracy as a form of kufr, a form of infidelity to God. Why? What need does the Lord of existence have for humans creating a government in its name? It is already all things, present in absolutely everything there is, negative and positive. What possible benefit does a government, an Islamic government, Christian government, Jewish government, Hindu government, whatever government, have to the Lord of being? That is also a form of presumption on the part of the human subject to assume that God wants a government in their name. At one point of history, at one point of time, because of the way that things, unfolded, especially in Medina during the lifetime of the Prophet, that's something else. And also that model was unique to that particular group of people. And the way that they also lived that model was very different to what transpired in Iran or under the Taliban or whatever. They don't, these theocrats don't usually see that. But this is the presumption, so that this nafs al-amara bil-su, this soul commanding to evil, my Lord, creates an idol, as it were, of its Lord. And this is another element, the dark side of this chapter that people need to bear in mind, is that, it is possible to make an idol of your Lord, to make a taghut of it, that becomes then the very opposite of what this is trying to show you about the reality of things. And you got to be very careful in that process, in that whole trajectory of things. In a counseling kind of context, it's very easy, especially if you have a client who's willing to listen to you, to explore these kinds of issues with them and implement these sorts of models with them and see, what kind of information you extract and empower them in whatever way that they understand to go out into their life and fix their own life. Anybody else?
Yeah, I can say something. I've been thinking about when you were mentioning the guardian angel or the daimon, and you said it was beyond sun sign, moon sign, all that stuff. I feel like I spend a lot of time looking at my natal chart and trying to understand something about myself from it, and I think a lot of it is true. But the more I think about all the different elements of it, because it's so complex, it's almost like a kind of polytheism, right? It's like this. It makes me think of like James Hillman's psychology or something, where it's just like he fully embraces a kind of polytheism, and then you have like Henri Corbin sort of correcting it and saying, no, it's really more like the Lord, that's the the individuation of the absolute. So I was just thinking through that, and I was thinking, and I know that there's also this debate between Iamblichus and Porphyry about this, and where Iamblichus says you can't find your daimon, you can't calculate it. It's something you have to encounter directly, and that makes sense to me. I guess if I have a question, I'm wondering about, what is the relationship between that Lord and those astrological factors, because we can consider the sun sign and the moon sign and all that as like something like the archetypes are ingressing, right? So it's like we get the archetypes, but we get them through the different spheres of the stars, and you can even attribute different divine names to the different spheres and the different stars. And so I guess that's sort of a question I have, is like, what's the relationship between the Lord and the planets?
Great question. Without spending the next couple of hours kind of unpacking this, let me put it this way. You walk into a room, okay, and you see a girl sitting on let's say a nightclub, right? Within this nightclub, there's lights, sounds, scents, other people, there's a vibe, there's an atmosphere, right? That girl that has caught your eye is both part of that scenery, but also separate from it, right? If you were to take that woman out of that setting, she would still be the same woman, right? But the relation then with the astrological elements related to your perfect nature or the Lord and name is very similar to when you walk into a room for the first time and you see somebody, like, for example, in a nightclub that you like. So picture that kind of environment. That thing still remains itself, but your first, impression is where you saw that person for the first time. And the relationship between each individual Lord and during the process of self-discovery and that kind of a scenario is somewhat similar. But ultimately, your Lord is your Lord, and the only roadmap to it is yourself. It is not the stars, it is not anything else, it is you yourself. And so the axis of self-knowledge, in a sense, is both dependent and not dependent. It's dependent to the degree that most human beings, not all human, but most human beings who are not on a path are influenced on the emotional and astral level by the movements of the stars and etc. So the way that Saturn behaves, or the way whether the sun is ascendant or not, determines the kind of moods that they get in and out of, right? Whereas if you are on a spiritual path, or you have some kind of knowledge of the stars, you're aware of these sorts of things. And when you're aware of these sorts of things, you can work through them. Whereas if you're not aware of them, that becomes kind of a barrier and a veil to you until you figure it out. But it is not dependent on your knowledge of any of this stuff, because also these things are external. And at some point you realize that ultimately on the astrological level, these things themselves are archetypes beyond what they indicate. So it would then make more sense to turn back to yourself, or what Plotinus says when he talks about epistrophe, when there's a turning back to the one. So you turn back to yourself and you become your own roadmap to yourself and to your Lord in whatever way that you want to discover that. Now, the techniques that all of these various esoteric orders, and especially in Tasawwuf and Sufism, is the use of the zikr. And, depending on the order, most sheikhs and murshids, after a given initiation, will give a particular zikr to a given novice to practice over a period of time and see what kind of experiences come to them. Usually, unless I know the person face to face, I only give out to people two zikrs. And one is the zikr of Allah to you, because it's the all-comprehensive name, and also the zikr of Ya Rahman. And you can choose one or the other and then practice as long as you want with either or both of them at the same time, and see where this takes you.
Okay, that's really helpful. Thanks.
You're welcome. All right, folks, we've gone well over an hour. I'll send you another question. Go for it.
Okay. The last one,
Okay.
let's say, hypothetically, so about the naming of the chapters, what crossed my mind, for example, the chapter of Idris alayhi salam, the name was Quddus.
Yes.
And the whole chapter, from the beginning to the end, the root name, it was Ali.
Yeah.
Here, this chapter, the name of Allah is Ali, but this word, its letter, doesn't occur even once of
in
the
the whole
chapter.
chapter. I know.
It seems very
Yeah.
randomly.
Yeah, Ibn Arabi plays these kinds of mind games. Yeah. Until then, you go into the commentaries, and then everybody has their own theory as what Ibn Arabi is doing. And it gets really confusing from one commentator to the next, until I basically said, forget it. I'm just going to, Ibn Arabi is his own commentator. Let's see what he wants to show us through his own words. So this is a great point that you raise, because what it is telling us is that what it's showing us is that on the one hand, these names are transparent to each other, because the infinite names are relative. They're relations. They're not, these are not absolutes. On the one hand, they're transparent. On the other hand, they do instantiate themselves. So try to be in that state, which he says in the poem. Where is it? The second to the last poem. Neither annihilate nor subsists. These verses that he's putting give us a glimpse of what that kind of realization with these names are about, because they also are slowly inching us into a state, a manzel of tasting this fana wa baqa experience with each of these individual names. And this is the thing, some people expect these very dramatic kind of experiences in the state of annihilation and subsistence, where fireworks are going off and everything is ceasing, when this fana and baqa experiences with a lot of real Gnostics is quite mundane. It is an aha moment. It's just a opening to a form of understanding things that they didn't understand in a similar way before. So this is what Ibn Arabi is trying to do. And he's putting these paradoxes deliberately into this text to lead those of us who kind of understand that this is what he's trying to do to the experience of that thing. Because it's I reached a conclusion long ago that it's absolutely useless to try to intellectualize Ibn Arabi at all. That he wants you to experience what he is saying, not just to internalize it in the head and try to dissect it. And this is for a lot of the folks, for example, in the Hausa, who study speculative gnosis, the Irfan and Nazari, who spent years poring over this text and reading all the 100 commentaries on it and holding class after class, they're still lost as to what this actually means. And because I've spoken to a few of these people, whether when I went to Iran or whether on the internet, etc. And this is not what Ibn Arabi wants. He's doing this deliberately. He's trying to lead you very slowly, gradually. If you're, paying attention to what he's saying, he's acting like your murshid. He wants you to experience what he's saying. He wants you to taste it for yourself. And that's why. This is the reason.
Thank you very much.
You're very welcome. Okay. Next week, we will do the chapter of Jacob. This also will be a one session chapter, because then we have the week following that, we have the chapter of Joseph, which is longer and it's actually slightly longer, but it's a very important chapter. I'm thinking of dividing this into two sessions, the Joseph chapter 9, or whether to do it in one. But Jacob will be one session, so start to read that. And the dhikr associated with Jacob is Ya Ruhu, the wisdom of spirit, the Ruh in the word of Jacob. And so until next week, same time, everybody have a good week. Ya Aliyah.